¿Qué tal? Estamos muy contentos que están aquí con nosotros en FAX 2022 y en esta conferencia tenemos una invitada muy especial que su nombre es la doctora Liz Jackson. Ella es una especialista en el tema de la apuesta de Pascal y también nos acompaña con nosotros Yerko Gómez, que es el director de Fe Razonable en Chile. A Yerko especialmente le pedí que estudiara este tema, particularmente sobre todo el trabajo de Liz, que es una filósofa bastante excepcional y bastante destacada en el trabajo académico. Y Yerko hizo un excelente trabajo, formuló unas excelentes preguntas para Liz sobre la apuesta de Pascal, y eso es lo que vamos a estar hablando el día de hoy. Liz, thank you so much for being here with us today. Reasonable Faith appreciates your work, and we're happy that you can answer some of our questions.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Definitely. Now, Liz, for the audience that might not know your work, what can you tell us a little bit about your background? Maybe what are you working on right now, and where can people find your work?
Yeah, definitely. So just briefly, I teach philosophy at a school in Toronto, and they just changed the name actually. So it used to be called Ryerson University, but now it's actually called Toronto Metropolitan University. So I teach philosophy there. Before that, I actually did a year of research in Australia. And before that, I did my PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. So that's a little bit about me. I am American. I'm from Kansas. So in terms of my current research, my research is really in two areas. It's in epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and rational belief, and then also philosophy of religion. So kind of philosophical questions about God's existence, if God exists, what would God be like? And then my main area of research is actually about the rationality of religious commitment. So it kind of falls into two main areas. The first is about faith. So what is faith? What is religious faith, non-religious faith? Are those different? Are those the same? And then also, could faith be rational? What would it mean for faith to be rational? Does faith in some way go beyond the evidence? And if so, how could it go beyond the evidence but also be rational? So I'm very interested in those kinds of questions. Maybe those could be for another interview. Today we're talking about the second main area of research in philosophy of religion, which is Pascal's wager. And I'm going to talk more in a second about what exactly that is. But as we'll see, Pascal's wager is an interesting argument about the rationality of believing in or committing to God. So it also sort of fits in this general theme about what makes a religious commitment rational. So that's a little bit about me and my work.
Amazing. Yeah, we're honored to have you here again. It's really great to have the great minds in the Christian community here with us in this event. Now, before we go into the first question, something that you mentioned caught my attention. You said Pascal's wager is an argument for the rationality of the belief in the Christian faith, but it's not an argument for God precisely, right? That there's a difference there.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the very first question we're going to talk about, it's important to understand how Pascal's wager is similar to, but also different from maybe the more traditional arguments for God that people might have heard of. So, cosmological, ontological fine-tuning. I don't know if, people know some of these arguments, but those arguments, they try to argue that God exists. A simple conclusion. Pascal's wager, it's different. The argument doesn't conclude God exists. It concludes that you should believe in God, or you ought to believe in God. You could have a Christian version of the wager that says you should believe in the Christian God. So it's a theistic argument, but it's different than a lot of the traditional ones.
Mm-hmm. Very well. So let's dive into this. Let's go into the first question and define exactly what is Pascal's wager.
Yeah, definitely. So I kind of touched on this a little bit already, but remember the conclusion is that you ought to believe in God, or you should believe in God. And so, thinking about, okay, why should you believe in God? And Pascal's wager basically says, look, there's two choices you have. You can believe in God and not believe in God. And then there's two ways the world could be, two possible states, that, like, you know, things that could be true in the world. God exists or God does not exist. So if you believe in God and God exists, it's a very good outcome. Potentially infinitely good, going to heaven, having a relationship with God, those things are infinitely good. If you don't believe in God and God exists, you know, people debate about what happens there, but it's definitely not infinitely good. Maybe you cease to exist at death. Maybe there's an eternal hell, so it's infinitely bad. So don't believe in God and God exists is bad, maybe infinitely bad. And if God doesn't exist, then it's very plausible that there is no afterlife. And so whatever you do, believing in God, not believing in God, you don't have as much to gain or to lose. So it's going to be a finite outcome. There's not going to be an infinite gain or an infinite loss. And so if you look at just the basic kind of cost-benefit analysis, we'll talk more about how we might calculate that in a second. It looks like it's much better, it's much more prudential to believe in God because you could get something infinitely good than to not believe in God because it will either be nothing or something infinitely bad. So remember, it's an argument that you should believe in God. This isn't giving evidence that God exists, but it's a practical or pragmatic argument.
¿Sí quieres ir con la siguiente pregunta?
Sí, bueno, creo que parece claro de que este argumento considera ciertas teorías sobre nuestras acciones, lo que debemos realizar. En este caso, se habla mucho de la utilidad esperada, entonces me gustaría saber qué entendemos por utilidad esperada en este caso.
Yes, so the word utility, it's a fancy word that just means value or goodness. So however you want to measure goodness or value, you can think of utility like that. And so what expected utility means, it's a way of measuring the goodness or value of something, given that we have some uncertainty about some of the relevant facts. So we don't always know the outcomes of our actions and decisions, and we can use expected utility to say, this is the value of, let's say, some decision, even though I don't know what's going to happen. So here's a very simple example. Let's say I say, look, Raul, I'm going to flip a coin, and if the coin lands heads, I'm going to give you $10. So you have a 50% chance at getting $10. The expected utility of saying, okay, let's do that, making the decision to, kind of play this game with me, is going to be $5. It's going to be because you have a 50% chance of getting $10. So to find expected utility, you multiply the probability of getting something by the value of that thing. So hopefully that simple example kind of helps. Actually in reality, you're going to either get $10 or $0, but the expected value of playing that game is going to be $5. And so we can use expected utility. It's a very common metric that's used in decision theory. That also sounds maybe intimidating, but really it's just a method to make decisions where you use expected utility to decide what you should do. And actually this is what we're using when I explained Pascal's wager from the previous question. What we're saying is the expected utility of believing in God is infinite. It's infinitely good. Maybe God exists, maybe God doesn't exist. We're not saying definitely God exists or not, but we're saying the expected utility of believing in God, as long as there's some chance God exists, is infinite. And the expected utility of not believing in God is less than infinite. So we should pick the action with the higher expected utility rather than the lower. In the same way that if I say, I'll flip a coin and if it lands heads, I'll give you $10, or I'll roll a dice and if it lands a 6, I'll give you $10. You're going to pick the coin flip because it gives you a higher expected utility and it gives you a better chance of getting the money.
Now, going back to the Pascal himself, did Pascal believe that the evidence or reasons for God's existence were insufficient to epistemically justify theistic belief?
It's a very good question. And I think actually scholars debate about Pascal's actual stance on this question. But one thing that I think a lot of people miss is that before Pascal gives the wager in the Pensée, which is the writing in which the wager occurs, Pascal actually gives arguments for Christianity, a lot of them based on things like fulfilled prophecy. And so Pascal is trying to say, I mean, one way to interpret that is saying there's at least some evidence for Christianity that people should take seriously. And so actually a lot of people, we're going to talk about in a second, the many gods objection. And that's basically the question of which religion should you pick? And we'll go into that in more detail. But people don't realize that Pascal had already given enough, like so many arguments for Christianity, that he really thought the only two live options were either Christianity or atheism. And so Pascal actually answers the many gods objection in the Pensée. It's just before he presents the wager. And so a lot of people miss that. And I guess I'll say just in general, I think you can accept Pascal's wager and still think there are really good arguments for Christianity or for theism. But I also think that one thing that's cool about the wager is that it can tell you that you should commit to God, even if you're not totally convinced by those arguments or you have doubts about those arguments. So it can kind of take some of the burden off of the traditional theistic arguments and say those arguments only have to do so much work. They have to do a lot less work if you also bring Pascal's wager into the mix. Mm-hmm.
Así que así con la siguiente pregunta.
Ok. Bueno, ya pasando a las objeciones, que ya mencionó una, que sería la objeción de los muchos dioses. Creo que sería bueno si nos puede explicar dos de las objeciones que son más citadas en los trabajos, los papers sobre la apuesta de Pascal, que sería la objeción de los muchos dioses y la objeción de las estrategias mixtas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'll do the many gods and I'll let you translate, and then I'll do the mixed strategies and let you translate. Is that good?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So actually these objections, they're really targeted at the simple version of the wager that I started with at the very beginning. You know, believe in God, not believe in God, God exists, God doesn't exist. So that simple version. It's actually interesting that Pascal's version, like I said, he gave these arguments for Christianity, and so it's not at all clear that his version is going to be subject to the many gods objection, but the really simple version of Pascal's wager would be subject. Okay, so let's just start with the many gods objection. The many gods objection says, well, look, you said you can believe in God or not believe in God, but there's many religions. Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, many religions, and some of them at least are what you might call exclusive. They exclude each other. So believing the truth of one religion may not send you to heaven for another religion. If you believe Christianity but Islam is true, I think according to at least some Muslims, you may not go to heaven. And the same would be the reverse. If you're a Muslim and Christianity is true, I think some Christians would say that doesn't let you go to heaven. And so we have all these religions that say there's heaven, there's hell, there's these infinitely good and bad potentials for the afterlife. But why should we pick Christianity over Islam if they both have these infinities involved in the afterlife? If we just say, well, there's some chance at getting an infinitely good thing, and that should swamp everything else, it doesn't look like it's going to swamp it anymore, because we don't know which of the religions we should pick. So I think it's a problem both with the multiple religions, but also with the fact that there's infinities involved in all of them. So we can't just have this simple argument where believing in God trumps not believing in God. Yeah. Okay. So the mixed strategies objection, it also has to do with the way that infinities are working in Pascal's wager. Okay. And this is why it's good. We talked about expected value. Remember, when we have expected value, what we say is we multiply the value of something. So we had the $10 minus the probability, multiply it by the probability you get that thing. So we had 50%. And so then that was $5 was the expected value. So you're multiplying probability times value. That's how you find expected value. Here's the problem. When you have a bunch of infinite values, and maybe, there's infinite value 1, 50% chance of getting that, infinite value 2, 10% chance of getting that, infinite value 2, 3, 99.999% chance of getting it. And it just seems like you multiply each of those, the infinite value times the probability, it looks like they're all going to end up being the same, no matter what the probabilities are. This is sort of what the mixed strategies objection is about. So that's sort of the mathematical piece, but now I'll explain like an example to help maybe make it more clear. So let's say you're thinking about taking Pascal's wager. One action you could do is believe in God or commit to God and just do that directly. Here's a different action you could take, a weirder action. You could flip a coin. If the coin lands heads, believe in God. If the coin lands tails, don't believe in God and just live your life like you would have otherwise. So in action 1, there's a 100% chance that you come to believe in God. In action 2, there's a 50% chance you come to believe in God. But what's the value? The value is infinite. So whether it's 100% times infinity or 50% times infinity, either one is going to have the infinite expected value. And so it's this really weird thing with infinities where actually almost any action you take, as long as it leads to some chance of you believing in God, would also have an infinite expected value. So the many gods objection says it's not clear which religion you should commit to. Lots of religions have infinities involved in them, and Pascal's wager doesn't tell us how to choose between them. The mixed strategies objection goes even further and says almost any action you can take actually has this infinite expected value, which is very weird. It doesn't seem like drinking a glass of water would be the same thing as taking Pascal's wager, but according to the weird way infinities are playing in the wager, you would get the same result that they have the same expected value. So the terminology, just to be clear for later, a pure strategy would be like believe in God directly. That's called a pure strategy. A mixed strategy would be do something that's consistent with coming to believe in God, like flip a coin and believe in God if the coin lands heads. Hopefully that's clear, Raul.
Yeah. I took some notes, so hopefully I can make sense of my own notes. So then, what would be the answer to both objections, since there seem to be, well, the second one seems to be pretty elaborate, but what would be the answer to the first of the many gods, and then we'll go to the mixed strategies.
Yeah, so here's what's kind of interesting, is that it's actually the same answer for both. The same sort of problem is the problem for both objections, so we can answer them together. And the problem is that the people think, oh, when you use infinities, you should just disregard or ignore the probabilities. So when you have all these different infinities with different probabilities, you just treat them all the same. That's not right. That is the problem, and that's actually the problem in both the many gods and the mixed strategies objections. So probabilities matter, even when we're dealing with infinite values. And so I always give this thought experiment. Maybe you've heard me give it before, but you say, let's say you're given the choice between two different doors. Behind both doors, there's some chance you're going to get something infinitely good. Behind door number 1, there's a 90% chance you get this infinitely good thing. And behind door number 2, there's a 10% chance you get this infinitely good thing. And so then this person says, choose which door do you want? And you say, well, they're both infinite. They both might have an infinite good. So I'm just going to ignore the probabilities. I'll flip a coin to decide which door to choose. No, that's very silly. Clearly, you should pick the 90% chance one, not the 10% chance one. And so the lesson is, again, probabilities matter. And we can't assume that all infinities, they just have the exact same expected value. So when we take infinity and multiply it by the probability, you can't just say, oh, the probability goes away and it's just infinity. No, we need to treat different infinities differently. Once we do that, once we kind of make the math work on that, and I can talk about some of the ways I think we can do that more mathematically, but I'm trying to stay a little bit more of an intuitive level here, that will solve both objections. So for the many gods objection, the probabilities of each religion will matter. So what you should do is you should wager on the religion with the highest probability, the one that's most likely to be true. And for the mixed strategies objection, the pure strategies are always going to be preferred over the mixed ones because it's like 100% chance at wagering on God versus 50% or 10% or 1%. You know, you're always going to want to take that 100% chance because probability matters. So you can kind of, when you see that probability matters, it provides an answer to both objections.
¿Sí? ¿Algo que quieres clarificar?
No, está claro. De hecho, en muchas ocasiones he leído y escuchado a Liz mencionar de que las probabilidades importan y creo que eso se me quedó bastante grabado.
Sí, sí, definitivamente. Sí. ¿Quieres ir con la siguiente pregunta?
Claro, bueno, sí, las probabilidades importan. Entonces, creo que aquí aparece esta distinción entre creencia y credibilidad que estuvimos discutiendo antes, que sería el tema de la probabilidad que le asignamos a una proposición. Y en este caso, tendríamos que preguntarnos cómo asignamos esta probabilidad, digamos, a la existencia de Dios. ¿Qué es lo que determina de que, digamos, una religión sea más probable que otra?
Yeah, so my answer to this might be a little bit boring, but the answer is really you have to look at the arguments and the evidence. And so, you know, when you look at theology and maybe historical records and sort of the various considerations that are given in favor of certain religions, that can function as arguments or evidence that a certain religion is true. So, for example, the reliability of a religion's like scripture or holy book, maybe the prophecies from that religion that have been fulfilled, maybe historical evidence that confirms that certain things that religion claimed to have happened did happen. So in the case of Christianity, one of the common arguments is for the historical occurrence of the resurrection and how a lot of the historical facts that historians agree on, the argument would say it's best explained by the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. So that would be an argument for Christianity. But you could have arguments for other religions as well. And then what you would do is you would kind of look at those arguments and use those to evaluate the various probabilities to try to decide which religion is most likely to be true. But I do want to say on this really quickly, one thing that's notable is that religion doesn't have to be like 99% likely to be true or even 50% likely to be true. It just has to be the most likely of the various religions. So it's a much weaker claim than I think someone who is just trying to give the argument without appealing to Pascal's wager. You just have to say whatever religion I'm wagering on is the most likely of the other religions, but it doesn't have to meet a certain high threshold for probability.
That's really, really interesting. ¿Algo más que quieras agregar? Okay, before we move to the next question, something caught my attention from what you just said, Liz, that is really interesting, more on a practical level. Because many people right now, I mean, for example, Dr. Craig has talked about how maybe atheism is not one of the most challenging factors one of the most challenging worldviews for Christianity, but it's indifference or apathy. Would you think that then, because you mentioned that, well, people need to look into evidence, evaluate evidence, people don't want to do that. So do you think that Pascal's wager is like a tool to move people from apathy into a serious search of a quest for truth, maybe?
That's a great question. And I think, yes, I think part of the reason for this is because part of what Pascal's wager is trying to say is like, look how much is at stake. I mean, what if there really is an afterlife? And even just what if there really is a God? Like, what if there is an all-powerful, all-good being that loves you and wants a relationship with you? Like, wouldn't that be a really important thing? Wouldn't that be something you should at least look into? You know? And so I think you don't have to come here and say, here's my 10 arguments for God's existence, to get someone just thinking about the possibility of that and at least get them motivated to kind of start looking into things. So yeah, absolutely. I think Pascal's wager, this is actually something that makes it a little bit unique when compared to other arguments, because other arguments are just say the conclusion, God exists. Yeah, it's important for sure. But Pascal's wager says, you should do something. You should believe or commit to God. And I think it gives this maybe like motivational component that like other arguments that just say God exists may not motivate in the same way.
Yeah, awesome. Now, going back to the technical stuff about infinites and all of that, some consider that the use of infinites in calculation involving divisions seems to happen in Pascal's wager in its modern interpretation. And this cannot be done since dividing by infinite does not give us a definite number. Thus, there will be a problem in the calculus of the canonical wager. What could be the answer to this? Can we use infinity in the calculus, or is a reformulation possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think you can use infinities in the calculus, and you can, there are different ways to modify the way you're doing these calculations so that you don't run into these problems. So what we do in our paper is we actually treat infinities like a limit. So you're getting closer and closer and closer to some value, but we're actually using only finite numbers. So we don't actually do any multiplying or dividing by infinities, but we're still able to treat the values of each religion as infinite. What we do is we look at the limit of each religion, and then we see the ratio that they stand in to one another and use that to calculate the expected values. So again, we're not multiplying or dividing anything by infinities, and I think this gets around both the problems we were talking about earlier with multiplying by infinities, but also dividing by infinities. There are other ways to do this that I just don't necessarily have like time, or it's very like technical and mathematical, but you can use surreal numbers as another way to do it, to get around these problems, but still keep the wager infinite, still represent infinities. And there's also kind of other different ways you can represent them without running into the technical mathematical problems. So I bet there's some math people that would be interested in this. But my paper called Salvaging Pascal's Wager is one place to look. And there's some other papers I can recommend if you're interested. Feel free to reach out. But if you're really not convinced of that, if you're like, nope, none of that's going to work, I'm not convinced, you can just make the wager with finite values as well. So if you say heaven, we're going to represent the value of heaven with a really, 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 really big finite number, you can get many of the same results that we've been talking about here. So if you're really hesitant to do anything with infinities, there's also finite versions of the wager.
Ok, sí, de hecho Craig menciona algo similar, menciona que uno puede utilizar un número arbitrariamente alto para aplicar la apuesta y no comprometerse con el uso de infinitos, así que sí, me gusta esa respuesta que hacen en el paper. Ok, entonces podemos pasar a la siguiente pregunta, que tiene que ver con el voluntarismo doxástico, esta idea de que uno no simplemente puede decidir creer en una proposición o en algo. Entonces, se da cierto ejemplo. Por ejemplo, yo no puedo decidir libremente creer que el pasto o el cielo, por ejemplo, es verde. No puedo decidir aunque me ofrezcan dinero. Entonces, uno de los autores menciona la siguiente frase que le voy a citar, porque no la sé de memoria, y dice así: varios autores interpretan a Pascal argumentando que se debe creer en Dios, pero quizás uno no puede simplemente decidir creer en Dios, y la racionalidad no puede exigir lo imposible. Entonces, ¿cómo entonces los escépticos podrían apostar por Dios si no pueden decidir simplemente creer en Dios?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have three answers, but I'll try to say them briefly. Okay, so answer number one is that not all beliefs are the same here. So it's probably true that if I give you $1,000 to believe the sky is green, that you can't. But consider something that you're really torn about, or you could really see going either way. sometimes a belief is obviously true or obviously false, but sometimes you're like, oh, I'm not really sure. I could really see it going either way. And another philosopher named Peter Van Inwagen said that actually when he was in the process of converting to Christianity, he was in this position with respect to whether God exists. He could see the world as created by God and see it as not created by God. And he said he could actually move back and forth at will. And so if you're in a position where it's not obviously true or false whether God exists, then we might actually have more control over our beliefs when compared to something like the sky is green. So answer number one is that not all beliefs are created equally, and just because we can't control some of our beliefs doesn't mean we can't control all of them. Answer number two is that we have some kind of long range or indirect control over what we believe. In the same way that we have long range or indirect control over, our weight or how fit we are, even though we can't just change it like that, we can change it over a process over time, over a long period. And so, maybe you say, I'm reading way too much news that's about this political party. I need to branch out and read some other stuff. That might actually end up changing your political beliefs over time. In the same way, you could use this kind of long range control to change whether you believe in God, even if you can't just change it like that. Okay, so those two answers are about belief, but there's actually a third option. And that third option says, maybe we actually don't make Pascal's wager about whether you believe in God, but we make it about how you act. So maybe the wager should be about making a commitment to God. And that is something you have control over. And actually, Pascal, maybe, there's different interpretations, but Pascal said, go to Mass and take holy water and participate in a religion, even if you can't just change your belief. And so some people have interpreted this as saying, well, look, maybe Pascal's wager actually just gives us a reason to pursue a relationship with God, read the Bible, pray, participate in a religious community, rather than just trying to change our beliefs directly.
Now, I think we have time just for one more question. Let me see. Well, Yerko, which one of the remaining questions would you like to focus?
Sí, creo que considero bastante importante el tema de los argumentos, o sea, las críticas, objeciones morales a la apuesta de Pascal, que sería la 12. Si es necesario que la apuesta esté motivada por razones egoístas. Por ejemplo, quizás a Dios no le agrada que nosotros, por temor al infierno o algo similar, apostemos.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I actually have an entire paper where I try to answer this question. That paper is called "Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager." So if it's you want to hear more about this, I'm going to only talk for a few minutes, but you can check out that paper. But basically, the thought is that I don't argue that everyone who takes Pascal's wager, no matter what, in every situation, always has good motives. That's too strong. That it's probably not true. But I think there's a very plausible way, a natural way of taking Pascal's wager that does demonstrate both good motives, and in the paper I argue it actually can be a way of showing genuine faith. And so it's something like this. You say, look, if God exists and I make a commitment to God, that would be a very good thing. Because if God exists, there's this powerful good being that created the universe. And this is the kind of being that I would want to pursue, I would want to have a commitment to, I would want to have a relationship with. And so even the possibility that God exists provides the strong reason to pursue a relationship with God, because knowing such a being would be incredibly valuable. And you can bring heaven into the mix with that as well. But I think part of the value of heaven is the fact that we get to have a relationship with God there. That's what gives heaven its value. That will be ultimately we'll have union with God. And I think that's really, really cool. And so I think you can see the value in heaven and in a relationship with God and be motivated to take the wager on that basis. And I think that's a great reason to take the wager. And I think it's really, those mark really good motives. And I want to say one last thing about the selfish thing. So philosophers distinguish between something being selfish and something being self-interested. So when you're selfish, you say, I'm the only one that matters. I'm going to ignore everyone around me. Everyone's hungry, but I don't care. I'm just going to eat the whole pizza by myself and ignore the fact that other people are also hungry. That's being selfish. Being self-interested, all that means is you're doing something that aligns with your values or your goals or your desires. So it's self-interested to brush your teeth every day. It's self-interested to go on a walk every morning if that's your summer goal, right? It's self-interested to spend time with your family and friends, right? But that doesn't mean those things are bad or selfish, right? And so Pascal's wager, and actually decision theory more generally, just because it's saying do this thing because it's aligned with one of the goals you have, that doesn't mean it's selfish or bad or that you're ignoring other people when you wager. So I think it's important to realize that as well.
Well, before we go, is there a paper where you deal with the moral objections to the wager, or is it this on the same papers that you already mentioned?
Yeah, the faithfully taking Pascal's wager is one where I talk about the motives involved, which kind of is a moral objection. But the other one that people might want to look at if they're interested is called a permissivist defense of Pascal's wager. And I'll say all of these papers you can download on my website, which is liz-jackson.com. There's links to them and you can download them for free. But both of those papers kind of deal with moral objections. And I also, if you look up Liz Jackson or Liz Jackson philosophy, if you search that on YouTube, I have a lot of other videos about it too. So if you're like, I don't really want to read a paper, you could check out some of those videos. They might be more favorable to people that don't want to read papers. So yeah, look at all of those for more on this.
Now, something I was going to ask you something about what you just said. Let me see my notes here. Oh yeah. When answering this objection, it seems to flip the focus on the motivation, because the way that Yerko framed the question was related to fear of hell. But from your answer, I got the idea that it's not fear of hell, but maybe the desire of get to know God, have a relationship with God. So that's the infinite good, and not focus on fear of hell, basically. Did I got that right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, so first of all, you don't have to even have hell in the mix for Pascal's wager to work. So you can just have a positive version of Pascal's wager without hell at all. I do think you could take Pascal's wager for fear of hell. We can maybe debate about whether that's a good motive or a bad motive. But another thing to note too is, like, sometimes you might come into something with a maybe not so great motive, but then eventually, get to a point where you actually have a really valuable relationship with God. So just because, like, maybe fear of hell is like brings you to take Christianity or to take theism very seriously, I think that doesn't necessarily mean that your motives throughout your entire life are going to be bad either. But yeah, I think I generally like to focus on the positive aspect of it rather than the negative. So in that sense, you're definitely correct.
Okay, guys, we're at the end of the interview. I don't know if Yerko, you want to add something?
Sí, no, ha sido bastante agradable estar aquí con Liz Jackson. De hecho, muchas de las cosas que menciona están en sus papers y sus videos, así que, claro, si es que alguien quiere profundizar más en esto, puede visitar sus páginas.
Yerko is thankful for getting to know you, Liz, and it has been a wonderful time together. I appreciate it a lot as well. I learned a lot as well today. It got me interested into all of these topics. Let me just say in Spanish something. En pantalla pueden ver el enlace al blog de Liz. Todos los documentos, los artículos que mencionamos aquí, los pueden encontrar en este enlace en liz-jackson.com para que puedan familiarizarse más con su trabajo. Como vieron, es una experta en el tema. Asombroso, es una de las entrevistas más filosóficamente cargadas que tenemos, me parece, en Fax 2022, pero creo que ha sido de gran bendición para todos. Liz, thank you again for your time. It was really encouraging.
Thank you so much for having me and for your questions. So nice to meet both of you. And yeah, this was a lot of fun. So thanks so much for having me.